poorer you are, the faster you learn the language of silence. It sounds strange, doesn't it? Almost like I'm saying poverty is a school, and its first lesson is to seal your lips. But if you've lived close enough to it, you know it's true. I'm not just talking about money. Poverty can take many forms: material, emotional, social, and in each form, silence becomes both a shield and a cage. I remember when I was younger, visiting a friend's home. His family had very little, 3 children in a single room, a roof patched with corrugated metal that groaned in the rain. The air inside was warm, not just from the heat but from the closeness. I sat at the dinner table, eating what must have been the only chicken they could afford that week. Nobody said anything about the food, nobody apologized, nobody explained. They just smiled and kept the conversation light. And that's when I realized silence here was a way to protect dignity, to avoid pointing at the gap between having and not having. When you are poor, you learn very quickly which words are safe to say and which words carry weight too heavy for a fragile room. In school, I saw it again. The kids who wore the same faded shirt 3 days in a row didn't announce it. They laughed along with the others, but not too loudly, not too often. They avoided the cafeteria on days when they didn't have lunch money. They learned faster than most that it's better to be invisible than to be noticed for the wrong reason. You see, when you are poor, you start noticing how other people look at you. The glance at your shoes, the pause when you say you can't join the trip, and somewhere inside, a quiet instinct develops. If I say less, maybe they'll notice less. It's not cowardice, it's survival. I've met adults who carry this silence into the rest of their lives. In meetings, they hesitate to speak, not because they lack ideas, but because they've spent years being told directly or indirectly that their voice holds less weight, that others will speak over them, that their stories don't fit the room. Silence becomes muscle memory, and like any habit, it's hard to unlearn. There's an old saying, better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to speak and remove all doubt. But when you grow up poor, silence isn't about being thought wise, it's about avoiding shame. It's about keeping parts of your life hidden, because exposure can feel like ridicule. I once knew a woman who was insightful, the kind of mind you wish could speak more often. But in her early years, she grew up in a household where every word was measured. Her parents worked 3 jobs between them, and there was no room for complaints, no time for long conversations. As a child, she learned to keep her thoughts to herself. Even as an adult, when she had the means and the right to speak, she still weighed every sentence in her head before letting it out. Sometimes, the words never made it past her lips. When you are poor, you learn silence, but you also learn to listen. You become attuned to tone, to the weight behind someone's sigh. You notice the way people hesitate before bringing up certain topics. You hear what's not being said. Silence, in this way, becomes a strange teacher, teaching empathy, observation, and patience. But the cost is that, in learning to listen so well, you sometimes forget that you deserve to be heard. Some people will tell you, speak up, don't let anyone silence you. And that's good advice, if the world feels safe enough to listen. But in many corners of life, safety comes first. You cannot speak freely if the price is too high. If speaking means losing a job, losing a friend, losing the fragile balance you're holding on to, poverty has a way of making the stakes higher. Words, after all, can lead to doors closing. And when you have fewer doors to begin with, you learn to guard your voice. I remember a man I met at a bus stop many years ago. We got to talking well. I talked, he mostly nodded. Eventually he told me he had been a carpenter, but the factory closed. Now, he did odd jobs when he could find them. I asked him what he thought about the city, the economy, politics. He smiled, shook his head and said, "Talking doesn't change what's in my wallet." It wasn't cynicism. It was the voice of someone who had learned that, in his life, silence cost nothing. But speaking sometimes did. And yet, there is a paradox here. The same silence that protects you can also keep you trapped. Opportunities often come to those who are seen, those who speak. If poverty teaches you to disappear, it can be difficult to step forward when the moment calls for it. Some people manage to break through slowly, carefully. They find safe spaces, people who listen without judgment, rooms where silence isn't required, and in those moments, they rediscover their voice. It's a fragile process. A bird learning to fly again after years in a cage doesn't soar. Immediately it stumbles, hovers, flutters awkwardly. But with time, the air starts to feel like home. I sometimes wonder, how many voices have we never heard because life's taught them silence too soon? How many ideas, poems, songs, and truths were locked away not for lack of talent, but because poverty trained their owners to keep quiet? We live in a world where noise is constant, ads, arguments, opinions, yet somewhere, behind that wall of sound, are millions of people who learned not to add their voice at all. They're not absent because they have nothing to say. They're absent because silence became second nature. There is no neat moral to this, no easy advice like, just speak your truth. Because sometimes, silence is necessary. Sometimes, it's the only safe choice. But if you have the chance, If you find a place where your words can live without fear, maybe you can let them out, slowly, gently, even if your voice shakes at first. Because while poverty may teach silence quickly, life is long enough to learn speech again. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. James Baldwin. Maybe the first step is simply noticing which silences we carry and asking, did I choose this, or was it chosen for me?